What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the Super Smash Brothers and Platform Fighter tutorial series, we are going to be going over how we can implement recovery moves in our game. So recovery moves are moves that are meant to get you back on the stage. You can use them from anywhere, but essentially if I press my up and my special move at the same time, I will be able to perform a recovery move, and it's going to give me a little bit of extra jump and distance. Everyone's recovery move is typically different in these games, so you might have just a dash upward. This has a dash upward as well as some horizontal movement. You'll know you're doing the recovery move because the regular jump looks like this, but my recovery looks like this. And you can of course change these values to whatever you want for the launch, so you can add more vertical height, more horizontal distance, or play a different animation. Before we get started on the episode, I do want to let you know that this is episode 55 of the Super Smash Brothers and Platform Fighter tutorial series, so if you want to check out everything else we've done to get to this point, I'll link you to this playlist in the top right corner right here. So you can see every other episode in this playlist, as well as ones that come out after this one is released. But with that said, we can go ahead and get started. So this is a code and blueprint tutorial today, and we're going to go to the code. So this is my SSB template character.cpp and .h. These are the files that we need to be working in today. The first thing we want to do is go to the SSB template character.h, and we want to go to our eCharacter state enum. This is the enum that tracks what the character is currently doing, and we have things in here like idle, moving, running, jumping. I've added a new one today called e_recovery with a display name of recovery. And basically, when the character performs their recovery move or the recovery input, they will be put into an animation for that recovery, and we will put them in this state. Once the recovery ends, they can return to the corresponding animation, so they may land, which puts them back to idle. They could die, which puts them to dead, or they could be hit, which could put them in a stun state, and they may be able to recover again after that as well. After you have added the recovery character state enum value, we're good to go in this enum. We need to now track when the player is pressing the up input. We don't actually track this at the current time. We determine when they press it and when they release it and start jump and stop jump, but at any point if they are holding the special attack and the up button at the same time, we want to be able to perform this recovery move, and so we need a way to track if the up button is being pressed, and to do this we can make a new variable called isPressingUp. This is a boolean that determines if the player is pressing the up input. It doesn't need to be uProperty like a lot of our other variables because it doesn't need to be tracked in the blueprint. This will allow us to check when we press the special attack input if we are pressing up, and if we are, then we want to perform our recovery move instead of the actual standard special attack. That is all we need for our variables in this episode, but we are going to want to have a function for the actual recovery move itself, so let's scroll down to where our functions are. And I have made a new one called perform recovery. I don't have this one as blueprint callable, it is just void perform recovery. This is also just a code-only function. We don't need to access it in the blueprints at the current time. This is when we are going to perform the launch, set the character state, all that good stuff. So this is where the actual recovery action and move comes into play. Once this function is called, that gets triggered. Now that is everything we need in the .h file. Let's go to the .cpp and let's go to the constructor where we set all of our default values. First, we want to set our isPressingUp variable to false. When the character initially spawns, the player is not pressing up on them. Now, even if they are, it will update the very first frame after that. The vast majority of the time, it is going to be false. So we're going to put that as false to start out. Now, we need to make our new function perform recovery. So I'm going to go and scroll down to where I want to add this, and I've added it under my special attack functions. That way it's in the same area, and it's void a SSB template character : perform recovery. Now what we actually want to do in this function is set the character state to recovery and then apply the forces or the launch on the character. We only want them to be able to do this if they're not already in their recovery move, because otherwise they could keep spamming the recovery action and they could keep applying launch, which means they could keep recovering until they were back on the stage, or they could just spam the move if it was a good move. If it spawned a hitbox, they may want to keep using it, and we don't want them to be able to do that. So the very first thing I'm doing is I'm checking to make sure that the character state is not already equal to recovery. So character state not equal to character state : e recovery. And if it's not, then we can set it to recovery. After setting the character state, we want to apply the launch on the character, and the launch is directional if it has horizontal launch. The vertical launch is probably always going to be the same, but I guess you could have a vertical launch that goes downward. For me, all my recovery moves are going to be vertical, at least at this point, and so my launch character is always going to be positive on the z-axis, but it is going to be positive or negative on the y-axis because I may want them to move a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right. So the first thing I do is check to see if we are facing right, so that when this character performs the launch, if they are facing right, we want to move them to the right. If they are facing left, we want to move them to the left. This is because they could be launched either side of the stage, and if they have to recover, we want to make sure that the horizontal distance they gain from their recovery is actually advantageous to them. We don't want it to put it farther away from the stage than they already were. If we are facing right, we want to call launch character. This is a function that's built in Unreal, and it will allow us to actually apply forces on this character to launch them. This method is pretty simple, and it's also very effective. You can fully change the values that you want. So just know this is a force-based launch method. You could also have the launch or the movement of the recovery based on the animation itself if you have root motion on the animation. That would also work. But for today's episode, I'm just going to use these forces. So launch character takes in an F vector, and that is the launch parameters for the X, Y, and Z axis. We want 0.0F on the X because that is the depth that's like closer to the camera or farther away into the background, and we don't want to move them on that axis. So 0.0F. The Y is the horizontal forces. Negative 200 is to the right in my world, so negative value is to the right, and we're facing right, so we want to move the character to the right. And the z-axis is 1000 here. This is how high I want to be launched from this launch character. So horizontal distance, vertical distance. Then we have true and true. These are overrides. So the first one is the XY override. Should the forces applied in the X and the Y of this F vector override the X and Y forces on the character? Yes, at this point I'm going to say the recovery should override all forces currently on the character. So if they are being attacked, if they already have momentum in that direction, we're going to override all that and just let the recovery take control of it. Of course, they can still be hit at this point and other forces can be added, but any pre-existing forces are going to be ignored. This other one is for the z-axis specifically. Do we want to override the forces for that? And again, I'm putting true. I want to say the height is going to ignore any pre-existing forces or velocity that we had. We're just going to override it and use what is given from the recovery. Now, the else statement here just means we are not facing right, and that means we are facing left. If that's the case, we're going to do the exact same logic that we did above, but I'm using a positive value for my y-axis here, so positive 200, and that is going to be to the left in my world. So we're facing left, and now we're moving left. Of course, we can make this better by actually giving these values instead of hard-coding them. So we can make variables for the distances. So if I go into my SSB template character.h, I can scroll down to my float variables, and let's go ahead and put it here, and we'll say float recovery horizontal distance. It's not truly a distance, it's more about forces, but I like this more for the name. I think it makes more sense with what I'm planning to do with it. So we're going to say recovery horizontal distance. And let's make this a U property because we may very well want to change this in the blueprint. So edit anywhere, blueprint, read write, and I will give a category, and we'll give it a category of launch. Or let's actually say recovery. So we may have other variables related to recovery that we want in the future. Now I'm going to copy this and make a new variable as well for recovery vertical distance. And we'll say the horizontal forces applied on the recovery action for this character. And we will paste this in here as well and say the vertical force is applied on the recovery action for this character. Now, after doing that, we can go into the constructor and set them up with default values in here. Let's go ahead and put them here. We'll say recovery horizontal distance equals, and I'll use my 200. That's the value I hard-coded before. And recovery vertical distance, and I'll use my 1000 for the value I hard-coded before. Let's go back to the function that we have, our perform recovery. And here we go, I went a little bit by it. And I'm going to change my variables out. So if it was negative 200.0f, I'm going to change that for negative recovery horizontal distance. And for the other one, when we're facing left, I'm going to use positive recovery horizontal distance. Now for the z-axis, we're just going to use recovery vertical distance each time. And there we go. We can just change these variables, and we will change the way the recovery move works. We'll add more horizontal or vertical distance as we change it. And now perform recovery is complete. Now that we have this function written, we need to know where to call it. And remember, the recovery move occurs when we are pressing up and the special attack at the same time. So the special attack has a function that we've already bound called special attack. And in this case, when we press the button bound to the special attack input, we call this function. In here, we were checking to see if we could move and we were in a state that would allow us to perform the special attack. And if we were, we went into this if statement and we handled all of this logic. So this is what was in the series prior to today's episode. Everything that's highlighted here. I have added an if-else to surround this logic. And so the if statement is if we are pressing up, then we actually want to perform the recovery. We don't want to do the actual attack logic that we typically do in here. So if is pressing up, we call perform recovery. Else, we do all the logic we were already doing in this series. We don't have to change anything in here. We're just going to add it to this else statement. Basically, only do the logic that we had prior if we're not performing a recovery. But if we are performing a recovery, that goes first. We don't want to do the other logic. At this point, everything is in place, but we need to determine when the player is pressing up. There's actually a super simple way to do this. So remember I mentioned that we have this start jump and stop jump function. And these functions determine when we press and release the button. They don't determine when we are holding the button. However, when we press the button, we know that we are pressing up. When we release the button, we know that we are not pressing up. So, while the button is being held by the player, is pressing up will be true. It will only be set to false once the button is released. In which case, is pressing up can be set to true in start jump, and it can be set to false in stop jump, and we will always know if we're pressing up or not. Notice that I put it above the logic that we had in both functions because we don't want to ever miss this. This is not trying to say that the player is doing something with the up button. It is simply indicating that the player is pressing the up input, in which case we want to track it. So at the very top of start jump, I set is pressing up to be true. At the very top of stop jump, I set is pressing up to be false. Now, that is all the logic we're going to need for the recovery, but there is one other thing I want to look at for fixing bugs with move right and move right controller. So move right and move right controller are input axes. They are constantly checking to determine what the left and right value is of the character. So if the player is pressing left, this is the value they have for moving. If they're pressing right, this is the value you have. Or if they're not pressing either, then they're being returned to idle because they don't have any directional movement. Well, in here, we were setting the character state to moving left, moving right, or idle based on the direction they were pressing. But we don't want to do this if they're in the air because they get put into the jumping state instead. And we were already checking for this, but there's a new one now, and we also don't want to reset the state if they're in their recovery. For example, if they're in recovery, we don't want to put them to moving left or moving right. We want to keep them in recovery until they land, get hit, die, like I mentioned earlier. So all of the if statements we have in here, all three of them, we're checking to make sure that the state was not jumping. But we want to add an and statement in here and check that the state is not equal to recovery as well. So now these statements should read if character state is not equal to jumping and character state is not equal to recovery for all three of them. If you're following the series directly and you have move right and move right controller, we have the same logic in move right controller. So make sure you add these three if statements to have the character state not equal to recovery. Now, if you did, that will fix up any issues with the wrong state being set while they are in their recovery move. So now it is time to launch the editor. At this point, the editor is back open, and so the recovery move actually should work, but I want to go ahead and add an animation so that we can display it as well. So I'm going to go to my animation blueprint for my character. Now, in my state machine, I have added a new state called recovery. Right-click, add state, and you can name it whatever you want. And that state is right here. In my case, I can go from jump to recovery and falling to recovery. You may have other options as well. Falling is when we are finished our jump and we're heading downward, but we haven't landed on anything yet. If we haven't already used our recovery, we can still go to the recovery action from there. So the recovery state I made doesn't have any custom events on it. If we go into the state, I have an animation that I have added to the project, and it is actually just a 1 frame or 2 frame animation here. Very, very short. And basically it is just this character in this pose. But you could have an animation that is actually them moving. I'm just working with what I have access to right now. But you can also do a 1 frame animation like I have here. There is nothing wrong with that at all. And so that's my animation. In here, I have it set to not loop. Doesn't really matter for my specific case, but if you do have an animation with multiple frames and you don't want it to loop, of course, toggle that off. Now, to go from jump to recovery, I have a transition rule. And the rule is basically just that the character state is recovery. So quite literally, we grab our character reference, which is the owner of this animation blueprint. We drag off of it to get the state. And we check if it's equal to enum value recovery. And then we bring this into the result. So if we're jumping and we end up going to recovery because the player has pressed up and special, then we'll transition out of the jump into the recovery state. We'll play the recovery animation. Then we need to know where to transition from there. I only have the recovery going back to the idle because when the character finishes their recovery, they stay in that state until they land. If you have damage animations and you want the recovery to be able to go into the damage animations if they take damage, by all means, go ahead and add that transition rule in here as well. I just have recovery to idle. And the recovery to idle is a very simple transition rule. We're just checking to see that we are not in error. Now, this actually comes from the falling to idle. I made a shared rule. So we have this is an error boolean in the animation blueprint, and it just determines if we are off the ground or not. My falling to idle used this rule. And really that's what I want to do because I want to keep them in that animation until they are no longer in the air. So what I did was I clicked on my falling to idle transition rule and hit this button that says promote to shared. So if I go to a transition rule that I don't have shared, here it is, promote to shared. You can press this and then it will ask you to name it. So you just name it whatever you want. For me, I called mine falling to idle. Then when I went on my recovery to idle transition rule, which is right here, I just selected the falling to idle option. Now the recovery to idle does not have any transition events, so you can just leave them alone. The jump to recovery transition rule we looked at previously also does not have any transition events. But we do have another transition rule I want to make here, and that is the falling to recovery. To do this, I want to use the same method I just did for the falling to idle, where I made a shared transition rule. And so I've made another one that I've called recovery. And The jump to recovery is what I use for that. So character state equals recovery is going to be jump to recovery as well as falling to recovery. You can see that here. So at this point, we can go from idle to jump, jump to recovery, recovery to idle, or idle to jump, jump to falling, falling to recovery, recovery to idle. And that is everything we need for our recovery states at the current time. There is one more thing we need to do to make the recovery moves work for all of the characters on one device. So for our keyboard mode hack that we have, where I've got player 2, player 3, player 4 controls all being controlled on the keyboard with different input actions, you can see that we have the jump P2 event. And if you take a look at the other events I have in here, you can see that they are all pretty much the same. But the player 2 reference is actually calling the jump function and the stop jumping function on the character. You can see the target is character. Look at the target on the other ones. Target is SSB template character. So I have the wrong target, and I've actually been using this for quite a few episodes now. We want to change this to the start jump and the stop jump functions on the SSB template character class instead. We want to do this for player 2, player 3, and player 4. At this point, we have finished everything we need to make our recovery move work, and it will work for the other characters as well, even on one device, such as a keyboard. So we come into the game one more time. I can assign all of my users. And come in here. And as long as I press up and special, I will be able to perform the recovery move for the corresponding character. So anyway, guys, that is all I got. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope this helped you make your recovery moves. If it did, please subscribe, and please consider checking out the Patreon like a lot of you kind souls already have. Additionally to the Patreon, you can support me here on YouTube membership or on the Discord server itself. They will all get you the same perks, so you can really choose where you want to show your support. Some of the benefits you get include special roles in the Discord and the templates for no additional charge after subscribing to the tier when they are released on the Epic Marketplace. Additionally, I would like to show off some of the merch that we got. You may have noticed this added below your video. I have a little lineup here. You can check out all of the merch that we created. Directly benefits the channel if you support it, plus you get some cool merch off of it. I'm excited to roll it out. Let me know what you think of it. If you ran into any trouble, feel free to contact me on the Discord or here in the comments, and I'll be happy to help you. And thank you so much for watching. Have a great one, guys. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.